Okay, we're live with another Straight Up Craft Dev Day, and I'm Ben Parizek from Barrel Strength Design. We've got Selvin from Selvin.co and Brandon Kelly from Pixel and Tonic, and Lori G from
Freelancer. She's a
uh,
new freelancer.
New. All right. Well, today's topic is multi-environment configs, and we're gonna dig in and see how this works in Craft, see how to tweak and mess with it a little bit to work in a team environment, and just talk about some use cases and general workflow between multiple environments that helps make our life easy. So uh, it's a loosely structured conversation, so anybody feel free to dive in and along the way. And I'll start it off where we try to start off each week, right in the craft docs. So um, I guess multi-environment configs. What are they good for? They help us manage websites between multiple environments, such as a local development environment, a server where that website might be live, and perhaps a development or a staging server. They allow us to adjust certain settings between those environments so that we don't have to change a bunch of settings when we move our code between those different environments. And largely this involves our URLs and our paths for assets and stuff like that. And in team environments, this also allows us to have developers who have different preferences manage their local environments differently than one another. So they don't have to agree on things. Are there any other reasons anybody here uses multi-environment configs worth noting?
Yes, I sometimes use it for remote importation of settings because you could have things that basically as a developer you may want on your server, but you can import a JSON file and basically carry it through and use things like credits on footers so that information can be used throughout different sites. So that's one use case. You know.
So those are some reasons we want to understand multi-environment configs. It really just saves us a lot of time and worry when we get to working across multiple environments, and lets us focus more on the code and use the tools we want to be using to do that and such. So here we are in the Craft docs. Craft has a nice way of approaching this. Craft actually gives us some options to manage different environments right in our general configuration file. And the docs walk us through a couple different examples of how to do that. And I think it might be down towards the bottom we start seeing a full example of how we're going to start looking at this from different environments. Let's look at our folder structure next here. When we discuss setting up multi-environment config settings, we're talking largely about the config folder in Craft, and in particular the general.php file and the db.php file where we set up our database settings. And both of these files can have multiple environment settings in them, and we do so by creating an array within our array of settings for each different environment. So let's jump over to some code. All right, so by default, our general.php array is empty. There's nothing in it. But if we want to start adding settings to it, we can start overriding Craft system settings by adding certain features which we might want to particular environment. Here we're turning dev mode on so we get better error messages, and we're setting our default image quality to 80. Now we can just do that alone in the array, Or we could start to do this in a multi-environment way. And so when we move to the multi-environment way, we don't just add those values directly to the array, we add them to several subarrays. So here our first subarray is star, and Craft treats this as this will be applied to all of our different multiple environments. And here our second one is example.dev, where we would have perhaps a development site that we are targeting for a particular environment, and then example.com, which might be our live site. So here we have two different environments we're targeting specifically, and one kind of global environment settings that we're targeting in general that would get applied to each of these sub-settings. All right, so how does this work? Craft is, when Craft loads it grabs a setting from our server, and what is this? This is our
server name.
Server. Craft is grabbing the server name setting, and then it's going to take that value, whatever that returns for us, and it's compare it against the different values that we have in our array of. So it might check against these two different values. And an important thing to note is it doesn't go for an exact match, it goes for a partial match. So if we wanted to simplify these to just be part of the URL that is a definitive part of that URL, we can test against that part of our URL as well, and Craft would be able to match those settings. When you get shorter, you got to be careful about your, I don't know, playground or something. That might become a problem because your live environment might also have the string dev in it. So you got to be short, but you got to be specific to your environment situations. Anybody have anything to add?
I guess the one thing, just to expand on what you just mentioned, that I think that the period will a lot of the times get rid of ambiguity between what Craft is matching, because locally you would have an extension like .dev or .app. So if you use the dot in front, it will resolve. But if you have like a development or staging server that has a dev subdomain, if you postfix that or put the period after, you could have .dev and dev . And you would be able to match one. I guess Craft would be able to match it. It will match it locally if it was .dev, or it could match it remotely if it was dev . something else. Is that right, Brandon?
Yeah, sure.
All right, so using these same settings now, we can also start to control multiple. I guess so. So you can see each of these settings, each of these environments, we can start having different settings in, and we're going to come right back to this environmental variables section, but we're going to show the same setup in our database file. So if we push this, we might get certain features we want in the dev site, but right now our database information would still be the same database information in all environments. So we want to make sure that we update db.php as well, which might start out in a single environment just to have one group of settings for your website. We would get rid of that, and then we could add an array similar to that previous one that gives us settings in all of our different environments that we might be in. So both of so both of these files kind of go hand in hand when we go for multi-environment stuff. Now, one of the more helpful features in this is in the general.php file, and it's what's referred to as the environment variables. I guess it's referred to as environment variables, and this allows you to create environment-specific URLs and paths that can be used in your control panel. So let's just toggle over to this helper text file right now. So if we look at, here are 3 different environments we might have our website set up in: dev and local. And we could see that each environment has a different URL, and each environment has a different base path. So locally, we're looking at the path on my computer here, whereas on dev and live, we're looking at a path that is where our files are located on that particular server. And this is one of the big problems when we start jumping. And I'm going to jump into our craft settings here. And when so here I'm in craft settings, and I've created a, wow, nice. I've created a asset source. So that's where I'm going to upload all of the images for the news section of my website here. And in that source, I have to determine what the file system path is and the URL to those files on the server. But this is where the problem begins, is because that works great when I'm on my local computer or on a development site, but whenever I push those files live, they break. So our multi-environment config actually gives us a tool to start solving that problem, and it's this environment variables array. Here in environmental variables, we create site URL. We're able to define that based on each environment. So you see, we're not just creating the variable once, we're creating it in every different environment we want our URL to be in. And then in control panel here, I guess I'm using the wrong variable here. Let's go back and grab my news path, and we're going to add one item to this called base. And I guess I need a local version here too, which I currently don't have. So one thing we can do is in our array, we could define our local version. That's one way of this. So by default, we'll be using a local version, and if we happen to be in a development or a live environment, we'll be overriding that with our development or things. There might be preferences to do this the opposite way too, where your live environment is the default one at all times, and you override it you can override it with your local or dev environments. So I'm going to just drag in our path here. There's our local path. Here's our development server path. And here's our live path. So we now have a base path variable defined. Reading our assets in our settings, we can replace this with our base path. And I've made one more error. You guys can call me out on this sooner before I realize. I've over planned these paths to actually be targeting the news directory. We just want them to target as close to the base that we're not going to have to change at all. So we don't want to target the news directory specifically, because we're not only going to have a news directory on our site. And that means in our live site now, we can replace this path with single curly quotes on each side and the base path variable, and then the remainder of our path here. And I got to trim off this as well. and when we save this, we now have a multi-environment friendly file system path, in that it's going to work in my local environment here because it's going to use that local path, and when I push it to a development or live site, it's going to use the development or live path. We can also our site settings for our website in general. So while we might have a local path or local site URL that's different than our live site URL, we can update our site URL variable, and when we save this, this will dynamically get updated between environments as well. Okay, so questions, comments, points that I've missed?
I guess the second environment that you have in your file would only match a local environment.
The second environment.
Yeah, that one would match something locally with a .dev extension.
Yeah, so it would need to be a different dev dot.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
.com. So yeah, I've got a bit of a loose presentation here due to the format of this. So if you're watching this and trying to do this, be vigilant on the strings you're using here and make sure that they match the environments you're working in. So I'll ask a question here. So our site URL variable, we've created this. Does this affect our site URL variable in our code as well?
Only if you've set the site URL variable in general settings to the site URL tag.
Okay, so only if we take the step in our control panel to do this.
Right.
That site URL variable in our code here is pulling from that setting in our control panel.
Brandon, the thing that you guys just discussed regarding the site URL, I tested it before, and it actually worked when I had a domain set up in general.php, or I mean the general settings in the CP. I didn't have the variable. I actually had just a domain basically, and I set up the site URL on my file. And for some reason, the site URL was actually returning what I had set up based on the environment. So I didn't have to have the site URL variable set up in the general setting. And that's why I was a little confused, and I think I brought it up in one of the chats. But theoretically, that site URL that's on the screen should only return what you've set in your config if the general configuration in the CP has been set to the site URL variable, correct?
Yeah, I don't know why that was happening for you, but maybe you had the craft site URL constant defined somewhere as well? Like, could that have been a case?
Maybe, yeah, I'll have to look into that. I know I didn't, that takes precedence, right?
Right, and nothing in that environment variables array in your config means anything. Like there's no you don't have to type site URL. You could type my site URL. You could type whatever you want. Mm-hmm. There's no predefined, like there's no special case for anything called site URL versus server path or anything else like that. We use that in our example just because that seems like the obvious thing to call it.
Sure.
But nowhere in Craft are we actually explicitly looking for environmentVariables.setURL.
Right. It's just a matter of searching through the needles and overriding whatever.
Right. It's basically just a simple like string replace kind of thing.
Sure. So theoretically, that instead of site URL in the config, it could be called foo, and as long as I use that string on the general CP, it would work.
Right.
Got it.
Okay, and also just to confirm, these only site URLs only available because it's set in the control panel. It's not available to us in a template because it's set in our environmental variables here. So if we go to our template and try to output, say, base path, we're not going to get anything.
Yeah, if you really wanted to, you could. You would just type craft.config.environmentVariables.basepath.
Okay.
If you type all of that out, then you can get to whatever you want in there.
Okay, so we can access that if we go deep enough, or if we really wanted something to us, it might make more sense to just add it at the top.
Right, that would also totally work.
They are
The only advantage you have of putting anything inside the environment variables config is if you want it to be parsed inside those URL and path settings.
Okay.
But if you just want something in there so that you can output it in the templates, then just throw it at the top level. It's fine.
Then we wouldn't need to reference that subarray either. We could reference it directly. Okay. All right. So that's the basics of this multi-environment setup. And I guess, is there anything we want to add at this basic level? My next step is to start showing the one we've modified and made available at straightupcraft.com for team environments, and showing how we've made a few changes to it to help out if you want to manage different local settings.
There is something that I wanted to make a note of regarding the DB configuration settings.
Okay.
I was recently doing an audit on a site that had been built on Craft, and basically I didn't build a site, but I was basically brought in to look at the configuration and look for some things that were happening, and it was kind of like one of those private projects or whatever, but the DB that they had set up, they had their own custom config using the native support, basically what we're talking about right here. And one of the things that was causing some errors is that they were using username instead of user, and I believe the Craft defaults to root as the password. And they happen to have that user set up as well. So they had like username, and they actually had the username for the live database. But on the same server, they actually had they still had a root user that Craft defaulted to, and they were using both passwords for them. So since Brandon is here, is that the case, Brandon? Because that's basically what my findings were. That if you have in your database, if I were to use right now, basically, in the first configuration, I see user equals root. So if I used username, and everything should still work, but at that point, I believe Craft wouldn't understand the username key there, and it will default to root. Is that the case?
Sorry, which context are we talking about?
We're talking in the context of basically, so right now Ben is highlighting the username variable, which I believe you use user as the username value for the
database. Are you talking about like the global user variable?
Right,
or the database.
Right, database, right.
Settings.
So that one basically, in a lot of systems, like people are used to basically using username and password. So this multi-environment config I was auditing happened to be using username, and they were getting some errors because they were accessing the wrong database, because username I believe wasn't being recognized by Craft. And it was defaulting to root, and the password they had provided had also granted access to root. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And is that the case? Because I think in that case it might make sense to say, you don't have a user set up, and kind of, I don't know if it might make sense to give someone the heads up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so if you take a look at app/ etc. /config
Config.
/defaults
Yep.
/db.php. Yeah, you can default it to root. I don't know. I honestly don't know. That user doesn't exist, versus just that there was a connection issue.
Yeah. I haven't really thought about it. What makes the more sense is just like one of the things what I found, because a lot of people are used to using username, and they might basically instinctively just use that to try to describe the user of the database. So.
Yeah. I don't
But
know.
it doesn't really make sense to change that to username or to throw an error because you don't have the user or whatever. Just I guess raising awareness, and that's the reason I wanted to note it so that people don't.
Well, I think like one thing we're considering, or it's on our list and we want to do, it's just a matter of like making it a priority, is if there's a connection issue, it's probably safe to assume that you just haven't even installed Craft yet. In which case, like, we're thinking like maybe you just go straight to the actual installer, and we add a new like first screen to the installer where you actually set those parameters.
That's right. I saw that on the list.
Right, and in that case, like, if we get to that point, like, then it doesn't matter whether it's user or username. It's just a text field there at that point.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then like we could even maybe like throw whatever's already in db.php in there. So if you did like actually type username and you got that wrong, but you typed everything else, then maybe the text fields like default to what you typed except for the user, and that would give you a clue as to what you screwed up on.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're definitely not going to change it at this point. Plus, like, db.php already comes with user filled in, so it's just a matter of looking and editing the value.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. All right. So I guess the next use case here is when we get into a little more advanced development workflow between multiple team members. Frequently, I'm going to share, our workflow involves Git, and what'll often happen in these workflows is since everybody's working on their local computer in separate development environments, the configuration file for the local setup is hard to keep in the repository because it isn't always the same on every setup on everybody's local computer. So we actually ignore that file from a repository and allow each user individually to set up what their local environment will look like and manage the development and live environments in the repository in a more common way. Some people go as far to actually exclude the database information from the repository as well. So that's another step you could take, but I won't be going that far in this example. So the example I'm actually posted on the Straight Up Craft GitHub account if you want to download and look at it elsewhere, and talk a little bit about what we're doing in the README there, but I'll explain here that we're really just taking this default environment setup and adding a bit. And here's our general PHP file. And so what we're doing is we're setting a few variables up front to just, because we're going to use them in the settings below. We're determining if the URL is HTTPS or HTTP. We're pulling in the server name variable ourselves, because while Craft makes it available, it makes it available later in the process, I think. Or actually, I think we can update this to Craft config. We can update this, I think, can't we? To I'm pretty sure we can. I think I pushed it. No, I didn't push it. I think it's Craft environment. There's a Craft variable that actually makes this available at this point. we're pulling in a few variables at the top of this file that we're going to use later in our environment config. And then down at the base of the file, we're basically checking to see if we have a local environment config present, and if it is, we import it into this array, or we add it to this array. So really the main thing to see of what we're doing here is once we create these variables at the top, we're going to control all of our different environment variables right in the same array here. Because we're dynamically grabbing what those values are, we can set our base path and site URL, which we're going to use throughout our control panel, right here in the global array, and we don't have to worry about setting them in each different environment. And then we go through a handful of settings that we might want to control in our general file here, and then we check our file system to see if there's a file in the local folder called general.php. If I jump over to the file system here in this example, here's our general PHP that we're looking at right now, and then it's looking right in the local folder for a file called general PHP. We would, when set, have created and placed here. So in that environment, in that local general.php file, we might set a variety of different variables that we want in our particular development environment. The way this gets imported, it gets imported right into the global space. So all of the local settings are actually taking place at the global level, which you might not want in every environment, but since it only will happen in the local environment, it works out in our situation here. We're taking the same steps in our database file. We're not creating any new variables here, but we are testing to see if there's a local database file available where we might import our local database information from that file. So you can do this all in the same file here if you're only one person and you're managing your whole workflow, but when you're in a team environment and people might have different database settings or different preferences as to whether debug mode is turned on or what their local settings are, this is it's a helpful setup. And this is just one take on the setup. I'm sure other people will come up with different ways that this could be implemented. So there's nothing special about this implementation. It's just the first one we've settled on that works for our workflow. Okay, so that's multi-environment. So I just wanted to speak briefly to what things we're not considering here, and then we can look at a few of those settings that we're setting in these and maybe talk about the different workflows. So certain things we're not setting here are we're not protecting our development environment from being indexed or indexed by search engines or anything. So however you want to handle blocking your development site or your robots.txt file, having different settings is going to have to happen outside of what we're doing here. Actually syncing your images between environments might be another issue that comes up. Sometimes if you have a lot of images or that just take up a lot of space, you won't bother putting them in your repository and forcing everybody to check them out or slow down the pulls and pushes. So those might need to be synced manually. Are there any other items that we're not considering here that we might want to? I guess two more on my list, and I don't know where the status on one is while we can control our settings here with our site URL, when we're posting entries in a WYSIWYG editor, for example, it's possible that when we create a link to another part of the site where we add the wrong link. This is sometimes a common problem in development environments where a lot of WYSIWYG editor links get stuck on development environment links. Brandon, could you possibly speak to how the WYSIWYG handles URLs, and if there ever might be a solution where when we add links to other pages on our own site, they could be relative links instead of absolute links?
Yeah, it's on our list.
Okay.
It's.
So,
I mean, we solve this with assets Wigwam for EE
okay.
by basically like if you ever link a entry that's like considered a page in Expression Engine, or if you ever link to an asset through assets, we actually store the page ID or the asset ID in the data, and then when we're first like rendering the field or rendering the HTML on the front end, the first thing we'll do is we'll parse the data for those IDs, and if we can find any, we'll swap them with the actual relevant URLs, which takes into account the site URL and all that kind of stuff. So it's on our list to do the same thing here. We just haven't gotten around to it.
Okay. All right, and is that going to essentially be, it linked to I guess it's linked to an entry here. I overlooked that the first time. So it would be linked to an entry, and then when we select that separate entry, you're going to be handling that behind the scenes and helping us out a little bit.
Right. The actual field data that you see here, if you click on like the source view, you'd still see the environment specific URL in there. We would basically, in like a separate array that's like a hidden input somewhere, we would save a record that you had linked to that particular entry. We'd save the ID, and then we would be able to later on, like when you're actually saving the data, iterate through that array that was also posted, and then just do a bunch of string replacement. So.
Okay. Yeah, so that would be, that's one area to watch out for if you're doing multi-environments right now. Just keep an eye out for that. It's easy to kind of run a find and replace on smaller databases or larger databases to fix that up, but good to keep in mind. And then one other thing, and no pressure on this at all, is the database is not going to be synced between environments. So that's a dream we all have for someday down the road being solved. But right now, if you are making changes in your database, your database is in one environment, you got to make sure you're making that in the correct environment, or an environment that you can migrate, the database that you can migrate to the right environment properly. So.
Yeah, I think that's better left for the build process, because you can easily implement that as part of your build process. But
yeah. So I'm just calling it out as it's not included in this multi-environment stuff here. So how would you handle?
That's a big problem. The one thing we haven't put any thought into actually how to solve it beyond early on when we started working on Craft. We did look into a couple Stack Overflow threads and stuff on how to sync content between databases, and so kind of as a preemptive measure, that's the reason that every single row in your database has a UID column. So every single row has an ID, and it also has a UID. And the point of that is that the idea would be that internally within a system, everything's about IDs. But if you were to sync with another server, in that case, we would be able to take advantage of the UIDs to actually verify whether content is the same between two servers or not. So. It's not a solution, but it's like part of the groundwork that we had to lay to one day be able to tackle that. So.
Okay. Yeah.
Cool.
The other thing that we're also thinking is like it might be cool to just have a generic import-export functionality, which would also kind of help with content syncing, I guess, in some way, or at least like if you're maybe developing like a new section of your site locally, there'd be like a really easy way to get all the content ready to go and then just like export it as like an XML file and then import it on your production server. So that's another thing.
Great. Okay, so that's all more to consider in this setup. And then I guess what else to say here? I guess the actual we could speak to the actual process of moving between environments. I guess the most simple form is you're just copying your FTPing your files up to a new location. A more advanced form might be that you've got all of your files in a Git repository and you're pushing them to a repository service like Beanstalk or GitHub and using a deployment service to push those files out to your server. Any other methods anybody'd like to add?
Bitbucket with post hooks. Cheap way of doing that.
When you push to Bitbucket, it runs a script that tells your server to pull your code to the server rather than vice versa. Is that right?
Yeah, same thing with GitHub, but Bitbucket is free for a lot of this stuff, and you can have like a simple pull request and push or whatever, kind of like poor Min's push and deploy kind of workflow.
Okay. And I guess one consideration while doing this is, as long as you're in control of your environment and nothing's live, everything's rosy. As soon as things are live, you gotta just keep in mind what you're doing. One thing to note if you're upgrading Craft is if you might want to test your upgrade locally and make sure that everything just upgrades as you expect it to, and then you kind of have multiple options of how to get those changes to your live site. You could either FTP them or push them up, or you could rerun the installation or rerun the update from your live server. And I think in both cases, your site is going to be offline for a moment or two. As Craft runs its database updates, you'll get is it the 503 page?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Basically, Craft is in maintenance mode from the second that it feels like it's mid-update until it's all done. So.
Yeah, and I think, Brandon, you said last week that you might have a little less downtime if you update on the server versus pushing your changes live.
Yeah, I mean, the big issue with deployment servers is like we use Deploy HQ. The big issue there is that for whatever time it is between the time that the last file shows up, or even the first file that shows up there, there's like a delay between the time that the deployment is done and the time that you've figured out the deployment is done and have gone into your control panel and clicked that finish up button. Whereas if you're doing like the one-click update, then it's all just like instantaneous. You probably won't. Not a single person probably would notice. That is something that we might be able to solve partially from using like deploy hooks. So basically, it just kind of automates the thing. So you can tell Deploy HQ, or I'm assuming Beanstalk has the same concept. You can basically tell it whenever you are finished deploying the files, then call this URL. And that URL would basically tell Craft, hey, we're done with the update. Go ahead and finish up the migrations and everything. But there's still definitely, even with that, there still is a longer duration while you're waiting for the files to FTP from the first file to the last file compared to if you just did the one-click update. Because with that, like Craft's able to download the whole zip at once, and then like in a matter of milliseconds, put all the files into place and do all that kind of stuff. So versus FTP, like Deploy HQ and Beanstalk are all actually FTPing each file up one at a time, which just takes a lot longer.
Got it. And so in the case that you are doing that, probably your best course of action to kind of minimize downtime might be to update your 503 maintenance page in Craft, which you can override by creating a 503.html file in your templates folder and adding a nice message to your customers that's relevant.
Yeah, you can totally customize all the error stuff.
So.
Brandon, I think Beanstalk is incremental updates, so it only pushes the files that it needs to after the first deployment. So it's really
Yeah.
fast.
Well, so does Deploy HQ, but like it's just for a big update like Craft 1.1 when that came out, that was there were I don't know 350 files that got changed or added or whatever in that single update. So even for a incremental update, it's still a lot
Sure.
of files to FTP one at a time. Versus
True.
with the one-click update, it's like literally it downloads one single zip. That zip is a partial update as well. That only contains the files that have changed.
For
Um,
sure.
and then it's got everything locally, and it just has to move everything into place. So
And that zip file gets created from your because you guys have a continuous integration with Team City, right? And you got your own build process.
we do the actual zip file is generated ourselves, like in our own little craft plugin.
Okay.
Where we the CI, the Team City server, just basically every time that we push to the stable branch, it'll just create a new build and it'll save it in a particular place.
Okay.
And then our actual like release plugin connects to Git and just is able to figure out. We store for every single release. We store the actual Git commit that
Okay.
that the release was based off of, and then we're able to git pull and analyze all the commit notes that have happened since that last release, and then from each of those commit notes, we're able to figure out a list of the actual files that have changed and been deleted and been added, and then after that, we whenever an actual update request comes in, like Craft is telling it what the current build number is, so we're able to basically then like grab the database and say, okay, give me all the files that have changed, been added, or deleted since this build, whatever build you're coming from, and then we can create a patch that's like very specific to what you're coming from and going to. So.
Sure.
Great. Well, would anybody like to dig into any of the code behind the scenes of what's happening here? I don't have anything planned. I'm happy to open a file if anybody wants to see something specific.
Well, I think the common.php, are you referring to the environment stuff still, right?
Yes. Sorry. Yes, the environment stuff.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like legacy stuff in there.
And I guess one little note is that you could rename general.php to blocks.php and it would still work. Yeah.
Well, so originally it was blocks.php, and then like the day that we decided we wanted to change it to Craft, we released like one of the last blocks releases before Craft came out. One of the improvements was that general.php was the new name for that file.
That makes sense.
So, yeah, I mean, we're not calling db.php, we're not calling that blocksdb, we're just calling it db. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, the config stuff has taken multiple states. Like originally it was blocks.php, and rather than returning an array, you were actually defining an array called blocksconfig.
That's one more thing to be careful of if you are doing a custom DB config. I ran into it, had to troubleshoot it. But if you happen to accidentally name the config that you're creating as a custom config DB config, it'll conflict with what Craft's doing and not work at all. So
it'll think that you are still using the old format, and basically like the multi-environment stuff only works if it thinks you're using the new format. So.
Yeah. So. Selvin, did you have anything you wanted to point to in this common.php file?
Well, I guess I guess that's where a lot of this stuff gets handled and how your custom config ends up getting parsed and stuff. But the references at the top, like general.php and db.php, like I believe general.php has a ton of sample code of key value pairs that you could use in your own config. And I believe Brandon has pointed that out before, because does general.php in the default config, Brandon, does it have every possible option that you could set?
All except for I think there's like one or two that are secret.
So if you wanted to see what options you could set and use in your custom config, you could have a look at general.php under the etc folder.
Yeah, so app etc config defaults general.
So that will give you a lot of stuff to play with, and you can add it to each environment and set up your own stuff. So I think that's worth taking a look at if you're starting out.
And if you want, this is only my first pass at thinking through this, but in our custom config, some of these values we aren't even changing. I just decided to put them here because you might want to change them more frequently than other values. So that's my personal preference. Not everybody might like doing that, but like for example, the CP trigger, you might be changing that on a per site basis, or you might always prefer instead of P for your page trigger, or maybe just to be obscure, you want to change your resources and actions trigger, or you have a section on your site called resources and you don't want it to conflict with the resources trigger, so you might need to rename the resources trigger.
And that's exactly the reason that those are configurable, because we didn't want to block every single craft site from being able to have a resources section or an actions section or whatever.
Yeah, and so there, yeah, and so some other ones, you might want to change the default duration of how long people are logged in, or how long something is happening, or you might want to kind of control paths for other things that Craft's doing, like activating accounts or logging in and logging out. So those are some of the settings you can start to change. And if we get down into here to our dev and kind of local configs, we start changing a few more values just for our workflow. We turn dev mode on, which helps with error reporting, especially if you're sending nice bug reports to Brandon and Brad. It's useful to turn this on and get a little more information to share with them. A really cool little one that I like is there's a test2 email address. So this, if you add your email address to this, it will output everything that Craft sends through its email tool will be sent to this single email address. So if you had a site that had several different different sections that dealt with email functionality differently, and you had that site live, and you maybe had that site set up to be sending email to 5 or 10 different people at an organization for different reasons, you could basically override all of those emails being sent right through this one setting if you were working on the development site and wanted to practice testing some of that functionality. So that's a cool little one for development workflow. If you're working on multi-environment sites, this outputs @ symbols around all of the translatable items. Makes the CP pretty awesome if you want to see it in action. And other things, compressed.js, cache duration, memory limit, might be other things you want to tweak. I set all of the user session, remembered user session, and all of that in the local and dev environment to 101 years. So you don't have to constantly log into Craft over and over again in your local setup or environment. But in the live environment, we default to a month, which is Craft's default, I think.
I appreciate the vote of confidence there.
What's that?
You'll be using Craft.